Welcome back. The race to the midterms is heating up as both sides are sharpening their message. President Trump was out this week speaking to voters about his plans on affordability. Now, at the same time, Democrat candidates are getting a boost from some of the party's biggest names, like Kamala Harris and Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Joining me now is the former Transportation Secretary, widely expected to potentially be a 2028 contender, Secretary Buttigieg. Secretary, great to have you here. I know that you will be out on the trail. I heard you just had a big rally in a purple area. There were more than 1,000 there. I believe it was in Wisconsin. And in my mind, there's two kind of ideological debates playing out in the Democratic Party. And one is this socialism debate. And we've seen that play out right here in New York City. And we've seen some of the polling trends, including Gallup. 66% of Democrats have a favorable view of socialism. And I'm wondering what your response is to that and how you'll handle it on the trail.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that's kind of just become a label and sometimes name calling, where the really important thing is to figure out what candidates actually stand for. It's not surprising that you're going to have a different kind of Democrat winning in a place like New York City than you might in a place like New Jersey or Virginia or northern Michigan, where I live, or the other places we're going to be competing. But what I'm finding is that even though we're a big tent and different Democrats sometimes have different answers, we're asking the same question, and I think it's the right question, which is, how do we make life more affordable in this country? You know, this president took office promising that he was going to make life more affordable on day one. He said grocery prices would go down. They've gone up. Energy prices are up while he's killing utility projects that would create more energy generation. Obviously, we're really in a painful place as a country right now on health care, where a big issue in the midterms will be, why did so many congressional Republicans vote to cut Medicaid while they were giving tax cuts to some of the wealthiest Americans? And why did they refuse to extend the tax credits that will help with everybody's premiums going up? You know, the House voted to do it. The Senate GOP refuses, and the president, I think, could solve that with one phone call, but he just won't. So these are the kinds of issues that I've been hearing about, certainly that event you mentioned when I was in Wisconsin, really around the country, and I think they're going to drive the election this year.
You know, I think the president's response would likely be that the Biden-era high of inflation was 11%. I brought it down to 2.7%. I have the right solution. There's more work to be done, I imagine, is what he would say. I understand you have a different viewpoint, but you did mention some of these issues playing out, and one of them is the issue of biological men in women's sports. And it's a big issue. In fact, it's one that even Kamala Harris's internal data said moved the electorate by 2.7 percentage points. So where do you come down on that issue, which will no doubt be asked in a presidential debate potentially?
Well, I think approaching an issue like that, the most important thing is to take everyone seriously, take people across the different sides of this issue seriously, whether you're talking about parents who are wondering what this means for fairness for their kids competing, or parents who want to make sure that their kids aren't being discriminated against and get a chance to participate. And, you know, this is going to be different in different cases, right? Middle school is not the same thing as the Olympics. Chess is not the same thing as weightlifting, which is why I think these are decisions that are best not made by politicians. But I also have to tell you, I would be surprised if this is a top 3 or even a top 10 voter issue in the midterms this year. I know that millions and millions of dollars came from Republican campaigns to put this issue front and center. They might feel that temptation again, even though I think that effort largely fell flat when they tried to change the subject to this from affordability in the elections in late 2025. But to me, at a time when, again, you got energy bills through the roof, the president has failed to do the things he specifically promised to do, like cut healthcare prices or premiums or cut grocery prices. And at a time when we have these shocking events in Minnesota, right? When you have American citizens being arrested, being gunned down, something that I think can bring a lot of people together. Watching somebody exercising their First Amendment rights and Second Amendment rights. I know my party doesn't talk about the Second Amendment as much, but I think seeing an American taken to the ground, having his gun removed, and then after having his gun removed, being shot in the back up to 10 times, and then having the government say that he was a terrorist all along, based on no evidence besides the fact that he was a lawful concealed carry holder. I think those are the kinds of things that, as painful as they are, can can actually bring together a lot of Americans to say, hey, we need a different direction. Or even if you do usually vote Republican, we need some balance in our government so that you got a Congress that isn't just a rubber stamp, that can exercise some oversight over an administration that's gotten out of control.
You know, I think two things can be true. One, it's a tragedy any time an American citizen dies. Absolutely. And we heard Tom Homan this week talk about how he prays every time before he goes out. He doesn't want even the illegal immigrant who might have a criminal record to be harmed in the process of obtaining them. But at the same time, Americans clearly called for immigration enforcement. They called for not a lawless southern border where 2 million gotaways happened during the Biden administration. So what's the response to those in your party who are saying abolish ICE? Because that is not where the American people stand.
Yeah, I think Americans want and expect that we will have a secure border, understand that we have immigration laws, and that those immigration laws have to be enforced. But what we're seeing is not that. What we're seeing is the people who are supposed to be enforcing the law are breaking the law. It's been held in court that they have violated countless court orders, and the people they're going after are not increasingly and proportionally not just the person we can all agree needs to be deported and dealt with, somebody with a criminal record. But, when you see a 5-year-old kid in a Spider-Man backpack being treated, being incarcerated this way, when you see people who did follow the rules, follow the laws, did everything they're supposed to, and they are still getting arrested, mistakenly deported, having their rights violated, when you see this photo of an American woman opening the door to her home and on her doorstep finds half a dozen agents, federal agents in tactical gear that is more tricked out than what I would take outside the wire when I was in Afghanistan. Again, on the door of an American porch, I think most people get that that is wrong. It is not making us safer. And, the border police should be dealing with the border. I don't know what border is in Minnesota.
Yeah, and I would note DHS's response would be
I know what border's in Minnesota. Let me correct myself, but not Minneapolis.
I'm sure you do know the borders there. DHS's response would be that they were taking care of that 5-year-old in that moment. They also would say 70% of those who they have obtained have a criminal record. That's their response. I do want to ask you about foreign policy. We've seen Maduro, who is now in custody here in New York City. He will be on trial. And I know initially you were critical of the operation President Trump conducted, but now, as we heard from Marco Rubio, 2,000 prisoners released. There have been pastors who have been released. Venezuela says all American citizens have been released. What's your response now with the benefit of hindsight, and what would you have done as commander-in-chief?
Look, there's a lot of dictators around the world that I don't like. Maduro's one of them. That doesn't mean that the U.S. should use force to overthrow them one by one. Anytime we're talking about using force, and I say this as somebody who was sent into a war on the orders of an American president, the bar has to be higher. It has to be in the core security interest of this country. And there has to be no alternative. And I just don't see any evidence of that in the case of Venezuela. And, the rationale that the administration gave was that this was about drug trafficking. But if we're really serious about that, we have yet to hear an answer from the White House on why the President Trump, pardoned the president of Honduras, the ex-president who was convicted in an American courtroom of bringing in, I think, 400, I can't even remember how many millions of tons of cocaine, of billions of individual doses of cocaine into the United States. How did this criminal get a pardon from President Trump? Did he contribute to the Ballroom Project? Did he buy some of that cryptocurrency and make the Trump family wealthier? Why are these many fraudsters getting those pardons? And I think the pardon power, whether we're talking about the people who were convicted of beating up cops on January 6th, or whether we're talking about the ex-president of Honduras, should be a much bigger story in this country.
Secretary Buttigieg, I would note that Marco Rubio gave an explanation this week. The president felt that the Honduran president, former, I should note, was untreated fairly. But thank you for your viewpoint. We love having alternative viewpoints here. And we'll be following you, and I know you've already answered you won't share with us if you're running in 2028, which is why I did not ask. So thank you so much.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.